Hey friends, it's your pal Mike Shea from Flourish here with the Lazy D&D Talk Show. In this show, we talk about all things D&D. This show is brought to you by the patrons of Flourish. If you want to help support shows like this, you can do so by following the link in the show notes below and becoming a patron of Flourish. Patrons get access to all kinds of exclusive material, exclusive adventures, guidelines, and tools to help you run your games, but most of all, you help me support shows like this. So thank you very much for your support to the patrons of Flourish. We have a lot of things to talk about today, a lot of things. And I'm unfortunately, I'm going to be starting off with a bit of a downer. So for those of you who have been watching my Lazy D&D prep shows where we talk about games, I've talked about one of my players, Bryan. And I mentioned a couple weeks ago that Bryan had kind of fallen off the grid. Unfortunately, I found out that my friend Bryan had died, that shortly, within hours of the last game that we had been playing, Blades in the Dark game, he had visited a friend and came back from visiting a friend, and he was out of communication with his family, and they went over and found out that he had died. He had died of a heart attack. And I didn't want to bring this up to be a big downer, but I wanted to bring it up to kind of, because it really, my friends and I have been talking about, we're going to talk about it today, right? My friends that have played with Bryan for years. And I've played with Bryan for about 7 years, right? He was a pickup guy. He was a guy that when I played at a local game shop here in my town, at a shop that no longer exists actually, I was running in-person games without I was just letting people show up. I would mention it that, hey, we got this game. They'd advertise it in their letter for the shop, and then people would show up and we'd play D&D. And he showed up right away, right? He actually hadn't heard about that, but he walked by and said, oh my God, you guys are playing D&D. And he joined us, and we played, that was during Hoard of the Dragon Queen. And so he was the player that I had been playing with the longest in my current group. And the only one that I had played with who was still, that I had met at that game shop. And we played Hoard of the Dragon Queen, Princes of the Apocalypse, Out of the Abyss, Curse of Strahd, Storm King's Thunder, Waterdeep Dragon Heist, Tomb of Annihilation, Eberron, Ghosts of Saltmarsh, every campaign that I've played since, which is like D&D campaigns. He was in all of those, and he was a lot of fun to be with, and I'm going to miss him a lot. My players and I are going to miss playing with him a lot. And it reinforces for me how much this game matters, right? There's a reason. I have an article on Flourish, which with somewhat unfortunate title given the topic, that playing D&D can save your life. And I think this was, we all talked about it. Bryan was on the spectrum, and I know he had mentioned the fact that it didn't work out with him in other gaming groups with other people, because he had a couple of idiosyncrasies that once you understood them, you could deal with, and they worked great. And I had sort of a Bryan cheat sheet for new people coming into the group, right? Say we have a member of our group who's autistic. Here are like a couple of his triggers, right? These are a couple of things that will happen during the game, and here's how to respond to them. And if you do those, everything works great. And I had one of my players who was one of my more recent players who said, that worked perfectly, right? We had, you told me what he was going to do, and he did it, and you told me how I should respond when it happens, and we did, and it worked great, right? And in his case, because he was on the spectrum, he didn't always know if he was making people mad, right? And he, unlike us, where we can kind of sense body language and stuff like that, he didn't. And so his response was, he would sometimes say, "Are you mad at me?" for no reason at all. And you might not even have said anything to him at all. And he'd say, "Are you mad at me?" And the answer is, "No, I'm not mad. You're doing great," right? And as long as you recognize he would just do that, because it would really throw people off if you didn't know that he was going to say it. You'd be like, why would you think I'm mad, right? You get defensive, and it'd be a weird situation. Once you knew that he did that, it was fine. But with other groups, it could create weird tension, and it caused problems. I know that it mattered a lot for us to be able to have him. He was the most consistent player that I had. And I know the game mattered a lot to him. I know that he liked it a lot. I would talk to him a lot about it. I'd have lunch with him and we'd talk about it. And, it matters, right? This game matters. And there's something that I really think about when I'm doing here, and the kinds of things that I think are important, and why I put as much energy. A lot of the reason I put as much energy towards this whole hobby as I do is because I know how much it can matter to people. I know that it's hard for people to have meaningful relationships. I have another article that I wrote recently about how to make and keep friendships, right? And how to draw those friendships and make them stronger. Because in our world of social media, there's lots of data and lots of research on this if you want to look into it. Social media is not a great way for friendships to stay connected. It's not a great way to meet people. It's not a great way to build strong friendships. I think D&D is, right? And I think that given the proximity and given the amount of time that we spend and given that we are being creative together, I think it's really important, right? I think it really matters. I know it matters to me, right? I know that my games matter to me. And when COVID happened, when COVID first started out, for me, it wasn't even a question of whether or not I was going to switch to play online. Immediately we switched to online play. Like, I don't think we missed a week, right? And I remember after a few weeks, after a few months, kind of late 2020, early 2021, I had some friends of mine who, they have families and they have friends of their own and everything like that. And they said, like, I can't tell you how much this game matters, right? Like, getting together with you guys and separating from everything else, separating from work, separating from our families, and just getting together with you guys to play D&D, how much that matters. And I was like, yeah, absolutely. It matters to me too, right? It matters to all of us. And for us to be able to get these groups together and play, like, it's more important than I think we think it is, right? I think we talk about mechanics, we talk about, monsters not hitting for enough damage, and we talk about all this like nonsense throughout. But boy, when you take a step back and think about what we're doing here, and you think about how powerful it is to have 5-6 friends get together and play playing our imaginations together and share stories and laugh and just relax and be ourselves, right? Be our true selves, right? How important that is. And it really hits home when something like this happens, right? It really hits home when you think about like the hundreds and hundreds of games that he and I played together, right? And that he played with my friends. And one of my other players was in my other game, and we were talking about, we were already starting, it was just he and I, and like 4 other people were like, I don't know who you're talking about, right? And we're like, man, the stories that we have, that we shared, really matter, right? And I've shared them on this show. I've shared in old prep episodes about some of the things that have happened in our games. And Bryan was always a good sport about it, right? Like, Bryan, a lot of bad things happen to Bryan's characters. And I always was careful to make sure that like he was okay with the kinds of things that happened. And he was. Like, he would, he had a lot of character deaths, and they were remarkable. And we shared stories about those, right? We shared stories when he was alive, when he was around. So I'm sad. The nice thing is I did manage to talk to his family. I talked to his mother, had a really nice conversation with her. I'd never really talked to her before. And she reinforced how much the game mattered to him, and how he had firewalled off that time every Sunday so he could sit and play with us, and how much she appreciated that, and how great it was. And I shared with her how much we enjoyed playing with him. So yeah, it's obviously a sad day, but it's also a good day to reflect on how important it is to focus on these. So I didn't want to start off with a real bummer, but I did bring it up in my prep show last week, and I wanted to talk about that today, because I really do think the kind of stuff we're doing here, the work that we are doing as DMs, bringing people together to play D&D regularly, really matters to people. It matters more than I think people think. And I think the easier we make it for people to get to the table, the easier we make the game to run, the more games that we can run, all of that stuff is leading toward healthier lives, right? I really believe that. So that's just something I wanted to talk about. So speaking of Blades in the Dark, I'm going to have a 2-hour show, probably 2-ish hour show, Tuesday night. So Tuesday night at about 7 p.m. Eastern. I'll put it on the Discord schedule if you're on my Discord server. 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Tuesday, I'm going to do a 2-subject show. And one of them will be probably a 30-minute look at how our final Blades in the Dark game ran. I'm not going to talk about it today during our prep show, because our prep show, we're going to focus on Numenera. And it works better because that way I have a video that's just about Blades in the Dark, and I have another video that's just about Numenera, and I'm not combining the two into one video, which would be strange. So that is going to happen at 7 p.m. The other half of that video is going to be, I should move this guy up here, is going to be a big-ass Patreon Q&A stream. I have a lot of questions left on Patreon, on the Patreon Sly Flourish Patreon Q&A, which we do every month. And I got like 30 or 40 questions left. So we're going to spend the rest of that 2-hour block going through all the remainder of those questions for January. And then I'll put up a February Q&A for new questions for this talk show. So that is going to happen. There. There's been a lot of good discussion on the Sly Flourish Discord server about my rant about Monsters of the Multiverse and D&D Beyond last week. And I think we mostly still, I still believe a lot of the stuff that I said. The things I said, I stand by. But I did fall into the very thing that I always preach against, which is like making predictions about how things are going to happen. And I know I could very well be wrong. And in one case, a lot of people brought up the fact that D&D Beyond probably can handle having both sources of data, both sources. So my argument was that it's going to be really confusing on D&D Beyond to have 2 different Kenkus and 2 different Tabaxis and 2 different, character races for the 30 character races that are in Monsters of the Multiverse. And the idea that you have the character races that were part of Volos and Mordenkainen's, and then you have the character races that are part of Monsters of the Multiverse. They are called the same thing, but they are actually different. A lot of people brought up that probably if D&D Beyond already doesn't have a good way to handle that, they probably will. And that could be true, right? The same thing with monsters, that I was like, so now I'm going to have 2 Deathlocks. And if I do a search for Deathlock, I'm going to see 2 of them pop up. And I have to go figure out which one came from Monsters of the Multiverse and which one came from Mordenkainen's, right? Or Volos, whichever one that book is in. And that's going to be confusing. But they might, the answer is they'll probably find a way to deal with that, right? And a lot of people brought up that this is the better solution than replacement. That particularly after seeing how things went, there was an Eberron book, The Wayfarer's Guide to Eberron, I think, was a PDF of Eberron stuff, and it had a Warforged in there, and it wasn't really treated as playtest material, like you paid for it, but they then changed the Warforged from that version to a new version, and people liked the old version and felt like they got ripped off on D&D Beyond because they bought Wayfarer's Guide, and then they bought Rising from the Last War, and this thing that they had paid for disappeared essentially, right? The old version of the Warforged essentially disappeared. There was other arguments about playtest stuff, but I think we have less, I think we have worry about playtest stuff getting replaced because it is playtest stuff, right? I mean, I do. Other people get mad people can get mad for all kinds of reasons, right? Some people get mad about Deathlock Masterminds. So who can say why people get mad? But anyway, my point is like they may find a way to deal with this. So for me, kind of shouting "woe was me," that D&D Beyond is going to be this swirling chaotic mass, and we're not going to be able to know how to pull things up, probably was overreacting. And the solution that they chose of you can buy the new book or you can keep your old books, and you will have all of the stuff will be there, and you will not replace things that you already bought, is the better option for people. And that's fine. I don't think it's the better option for me, but it's the better option for a lot of people. So, and I wouldn't say mea culpa. I don't think I'm wrong, but I think I may be wrong. I may be wrong about it being too chaotic, right? But I think for a lot of people, that is actually the optimal. That is the optimal solution. So this show, one of the sponsors of today's show, it's the first time I've ever done like a real sponsorship, and it's it's a kind of a paid endorsement, right? For Tome Beast 3. I talk about Kickstarters, and the truth is, I would absolutely spotlight, and I think I've talked about it even before we got this deal. But 2 things happen. One is I am going to have a monster in it, so it's now a little self-serving. But also, a Kobold Press helped endorse, help sponsor my work. So I'm getting paid from them for this. However, I would totally spotlight this thing anyway, because as we all know, I'm a big fan of Kobold Press. I love Kobold Press material. And there is no way you could keep me from backing the Tome Beast 3 Kickstarter. And it has launched. I don't think it had launched the last time we talked. So I'm going to paste the link, and you can get to the Kickstarter in the show notes below. I know, a sponsor, crazy. And don't get excited. I don't expect to do many sponsorships. It's kind of a unique thing for them because I worked with them a lot. So the Tome Beast 3 is a huge book of new monsters for your 5th edition game. And we're going to be talking a lot about monsters. We talked about Monsters in the Multiverse last week. We talked about like the previews of the monsters from Monsters in the Multiverse. If you want to see like where we dug into some of the monsters themselves, look back at that last week's show. And later we're going to be talking about the Level Up 5e Monstrous Grimoire. So there are so many books of monsters. And then we have, rumors are that MCDM, Matt Colville's company, is going to be putting out and crowdfunding, kickstarting a book of monsters themselves. And like Level Up 5e, it is intended to be a monster manual replacement. The Tome Beast is not a monster manual replacement. It is an adjunct to the existing sets of monsters. They're doing very well, obviously. 5,900 backers with 24 days to go. That is a tremendous number of backers. Monster books are always very popular. Monster books are interesting because you would think that like you have enough. But you can always make more monsters, right? And there's good value. Like, sure, you can reskin, right? We have all the tricks of the Lazy Dungeon Master here. Like, take the monster manual, find a monster that's close enough to what you want, and reskin it. But then it's something else when you find really interesting designs from designers who are paid to actually make good monsters for it, right? And boy, Kobold Press has been doing this. This will be their 4th book of monsters. They have a couple thousand monsters. We're close to 1,500 monsters that they're going to have. And all of them are great. I have all 3. I have Tome Beast 1 and 2 and Creature Codex sitting right up there on my shelf. And exciting stuff. And the rewards are good. The value is good. It's $30 for the PDF. It is $45. I always found that the print copies are usually a pretty good deal. Let's see. They have all sorts of VTT versions that you can get. The hardcover and PDF is $60, pretty reasonable. Does that come with layers? I don't believe that comes with layers. Yes. So $90 gets you Tome of Beast 3 hardcover. The layers, oh wow, the layers is going to be hardcover. Normally the layers is a softcover book. I didn't know that. So 2 hardcover books and PDFs of both of those books for $90, which is what that's what I backed. You know, I love their physical quality of their books are excellent. And it's excellent and getting better. Like the quality of the book has gotten better. I think they switched paper types to a glossier, somewhat thinner, but still very good, glossier paper quality that has a better depth of the artwork. So I'm hoping that they will use that for this too. And it's, excellent stuff. So real great stuff. Their Kickstarter, and then you can see all kinds of previews, and they have all kinds of different guests, including yours truly, that are going to have a monster in there. I'm kind of excited. I hope they preview my monster. I just sent it in on Friday. So they might be able to talk about my little addition here. And lots of stretch goals, lots of growth and new things. Oh, and this is the first time that they're doing miniatures, right? So they're adding a whole bunch of different miniature stuff in there. So you can take a look at that. I'm not big into adding, I'm so good on miniatures. It's not for me, but there are lots of people who love to get miniatures and dice sets and things like that. So it's really cool. Check it out. Use the link in the show notes below if you are excited about backing it. But boy, you can't go wrong. Kobold Press, I think I did a poll. And I think it's pretty clear that they are the number one producer of third-party material for 5e. Like everybody just loves Kobold Press, and all for good reason. They make really, really excellent stuff. So that is Tome of Beast. So now, wow, we're doing good. Let's talk about today's spotlight, and we are focusing once again on monsters. And the book that we're going to look at came out a little while ago. This is the Level Up 5e, Level Up Advanced 5e, Monstrous Menagerie. If you are familiar, so Level Up 5e is a series of books produced by N-World, N-World Publishing. N-World has run a message forum and community for D&D for decades, right? They've had very, very popular message board talking about D&D. That's been going on forever. Lots of interesting. Gary Gygax used to write posts on this forum. And they have been getting bigger and bigger and doing more and more. And they took the ambitious step of making a 5e replacement. So fully 5e compatible. You can take any of the books that they've created. They created three books: the Monstrous Menagerie, their version of a player's guide, and their version of like an adventurer's guide, right? That's sort of their version of a DMG. And all of the material from all of these books is compatible with, vanilla 5e. So you can use character classes from the Level Up 5e book with side by side with character classes from your 5th edition D&D products, right? And they're all fully compatible. Likewise with a lot of the things that are in the DMG. I haven't really dug into their adventure. I should go look it up and see what the hell the thing's called. Yeah, the Level Up 5e Adventurer's Guide is their sort of Dungeon Master's Guide, right? Or is that Trials and Treasure? Am I getting these things messed up? Is the adventure? I'm getting it mixed up. The Adventurer's Guide is their version of a player's handbook. It has class information and all the stuff that they need to make new classes. Trials and Treasure is their version of their Dungeon Master's Guide. And I may dig into that depending on how people feel about it, and if I read it, and depending on how I feel about it, I may do a deep dive into that too. That isn't something that I looked at yet. So I did, however, what I wanted to talk about today was the Monstrous Menagerie, and that is because it is very easy to drop this stuff right into your 5e game. Unlike, do I want to bring in new classes into my game? Which you could do, right? But you want to take a look at them, make sure they fit your style of game and your players. And that once you bring a class in, that class is staying there for your whole campaign. So there's a bigger commitment to bringing stuff like that in. But a monster, like I can just run one monster and see how it runs, and it dies and then it goes away. And then if I go like, that worked, great. If it didn't, it's okay, right? Monsters are easy to drop in. I think it's one of the reasons why monster books are so popular is like, we know we can bring monsters easily into our games, right? We know that that's an easy thing to do. I did it with Monty Cook's Arcana of the Ancients, right? They have and Beasts of Flesh and Steel, Numenera style monsters for 5e. Very easy for me to drop those into my Eberron game. So that's one of the nice things about monster books is how easy they are to drop into your game. To me, the number one interesting question that I had when I looked at the Monstrous Menagerie was, is this better than the D&D Monster Manual? Right? That's a bold question, right? And a bold statement. And I asked that to my Discord server. So I have people that on Discord that have been reading this and using it. And I asked them, and a lot, they all, they're all silent. Like, do I say this? And they're like, kinda, right? And I think on my look through, without having run, I don't think I've run any of the monsters yet, right? But looking at them and looking at some of the features that they have and some of the direction that they went with the book, there's really only one thing I see where I say, yeah, that the monster manual is definitely better than this at that one thing. And I'll get into that. But like, there's a lot of really cool going on in this book. So one thing to note is that Paul Hughes was the lead developer of this book. And Paul Hughes runs a blog called Blog of Holding, where he did a ton of mathematical analysis of existing monsters and compared them to the guidelines in the DMG and did a lot of work. He has a really popular article called A Monster Manual on an Index Card. And I've spent a lot of time looking at Paul's work and deconstructing his monster math because I get in kind of the math of monsters myself. And I think it was really interesting stuff. So did N-World, and they brought him on and said, how would you like to make a monster book? And he did, right? And I can't imagine how big an effort it was. It is a 535-page monster manual, and you can pick up the PDF of this 535-page manual for $20. That is a crazy deal. So is it a good deal? Absolutely. Do I recommend it? Absolutely. I don't see, like, even if it just gives you a few ideas, right? Even if you don't use it often. Wow. 500-page book for $20 with well-designed monsters. And are the monsters well-designed? Yes, they are. So there's a bunch of interesting things that they did here. And I'm going to try to cover a few of these. So they have like the typical things about monsters. There's a few, I kind of like skip by the intro, a lot of the stuff. I'm like, yeah. Show me a monster stat block, right? But in this case, there's actually important things in here that you want to keep note of, like elite monsters. And elite monsters is one of the things I think is really, really great in this book. This is something I really missed, and I wish 5th edition, I wish Wizards of the Coast would add to their stuff. I would love to see more of this in other third-party products, which is hard mode monsters, right? An elite monster usually are like a unique version of a monster that are harder than your other ones. This is sort of a way of creating a mythic monster. If you recall that in Mythic Odysseys of Theros, Wizards of the Coast started creating mythic monsters, which are like 2-part monsters where once they drop to their hit points, they are restored. We did this in Fantastic Lairs as well with some of their bigger monsters that basically would change into something else. So they added this in, and they do it for a lot of monsters in here. Unfortunately, there's one monster I wish they had done it for, the Lich. I really wish there was an elite version of the Lich. There are elite vampires, which is great. Vampires and Liches are like 2 of my favorite monsters. And so they did it for a lot of them, but basically it doubles the value of a monster. It doubles the thing. They count as two monsters, right? And then they usually have 2 phases of a battle, right? So really, you think legendary monsters are strong. These are like double legendary monsters, right? So that I thought was a really cool design. They have legendary monsters, and we'll look at obviously a bunch of legendary monsters. And one of the neat things that they do with legendary monsters is legendary resistances. This is something an idea that you can take and you can throw right into any of your 5e games. Legendary monsters have a physical reason for having legendary resistance. The example would be if you have a Lich, and the Lich has 3 glowing ion stones around their head, right? And every time they use a legendary resistance, one of the ion stones absorbs the energy of whatever was happening, and it explodes. And now they only have 2, right? So that way, instead of saying like you have this purely mechanical legendary resistance thing, which a lot of people don't like, right? There's a lot of people that are, I like it because I think monsters need it. But a lot of people feel it's just a wet balloon it's like counterspell for monsters, right? It's lame. And so, but the idea that you can, but the big problem was there was no actual in-game reason why they had these. So you might say like a Tarrasque has 3 smaller horns on its head, each one with like glowing with like a weird arcane glow. And as the Tarrasque is getting hit, we should take a look at the Tarrasque and see, but that idea of physical representation matters. There are also a couple of new status effects that are included in Level Up 5e. I'm not going to dig into them specifically, but they show up and you're like, what does that mean? One is like rattled. There's rattled is one of them. There's another. I'm trying to see if I can find it here. There's other status effects that you find in here. And this book has the description of how those status effects work. So again, you don't need to have the other, even though it has some like unique effects, you don't need to have the other books in order to get those effects to work for your game. So, Aboleth here is an example. And so the one complaint I have, and I understand why they had to do it, there was no good way for them to do this, is they have no problem spreading monsters across multiple pages. And in some cases, they have monsters that are so big that they have multiple page stat blocks, right? And I get why. And I know that there was, particularly when you have spellcasters, we'll look at the Lich, right? One of my favorites. When you look at the Lich, like you cannot add all of the abilities of a Lich into a stat block and describe them all. Because like the 5e Monster Manual Lich, all of its power are in a tiny set of spells without any descriptions about what those spells do. So now they have ways to, they describe the most likely used spells, which is sort of the new 5e way. We talked about that with Monsters of the Multiverse last week. But when you do that with like a creature like a Lich, how do you do that and not have a stat block that's huge? Well, they just said we're going to have a huge stat block. The other thing is when you have 535 page book already and you're going to pack as many monsters into this as they did and as much material, they're just going to have to spread it across the pages. So I understand why. But from a design perspective, that makes it hard to use at the table because you're switching pages for the same monster. It's already, if you're running multiple monsters that are across multiple pages, it's going to be quite a hassle. So that's one thing I don't like. The design of monsters, they have lots of interesting things like signs. What are the signs that these monsters exist? What are the behaviors that the monsters have? There's a tactics section. People have been dying. People really, really want a tactics section. They have these encounter sections where like right built in is like, what would an encounter look like that has this monster at different challenge ratings? Legend lore, right? What can they learn if they do an Arcana or history check? What do they learn about the creature? Very usable, right? Really straightforward, usable stuff. And they still have the WotC style, here is the description of it with like, subheadings that kind of say, well-laid plans, what do they do? But then they have a lot of information that you can use. And I think there's a tactics, right? Combat, right? Aboleth strikes as many enemies as possible with its tentacles. So pretty good. Then here we have, getting right into the Aboleth. Aboleth variant, Ancient Aboleth, Eldest Aboleth, right? Elite monsters. This is that idea that it counts as 2 CR11s, has 342 hit points. Oh, they added the bloodied condition back from 4e. So if you like the bloodied condition from 4e, you can, it's right here. And descriptions of that. They have this interesting thing of like elite recovery. The Aboleth ends one negative effect currently affecting it. And it can use this action as long as it has at least 1 hit point. There's probably some arguments about like what counts as something affecting it. Like, can it bust its way out of a force cage? Maybe. Like, is that actually affecting it? Yeah, we'd probably say yes. The DM would probably say yes. But there's weird things like, I go back and Hero's Feast is different in Level Up 5e than it was in D&D. But let's like a green dragon who's breathing poison on people who have Hero's Feast and they have 100% immunity to poison. Is that a negative effect? Probably not, right? So there's some questions about like, to me that ends one negative effect. There's some fuzziness in there that I wouldn't mind having a little bit of depth. And maybe in the book, there's probably descriptions of this. But I like this. So you have 342 monsters, right? 342 hit points instead of the base stats of an Aboleth, which is somewhere here. 171, or basically twice, right? Twice as high. And that's because when it gets halfway and turns bloodied, that's when all of a sudden it gains these other things. It gains elite recovery. Look upon my works. Each creature within 90 feet makes a saving throw failure. Fragmenting vision of Aboleth's memories takes 33 psychic damage. Lunging attacks, moves up to its swim speed without provoking opportunity attacks, and makes a tentacle attack. So it gets more difficult. This is that pure mythic idea, right? And they call that elite. It's a little confusing it doesn't take that much effort to figure it out. But like elite in 4e, because there's 4e stuff, that they brought in to level up 5e here, things that were good at like bloodied, right? If you're a 4e DM, you might kind of get your head around those ideas, and you might hear something like elite and say, oh, so that makes it like an elite monster was in 4e. Well, no, because an elite monster in 4e was essentially a double strength monster, regular monster, where a solo in 4e was more like a legendary monster. This one is saying we're taking legendaries and making those double. So it's not, there's a little bit of a collision with the word elite when you think about 4e. But again, once you read into here, an elite is like a mythic monster. An elite is a double strength legendary monster. It becomes pretty clear. One big question I had about a book like this is I believe firmly that Wizards of the Coast's monster design above challenge rating 10 doesn't meet my expectations, right? Some people may be perfectly happy with it and go with the gods, right? I am happy that you're happy. For me, I have found, having run many monsters at higher challenge ratings, that they don't hold up nearly as well as a threat as low monsters do for low characters. Low challenge rating monsters do for low characters, right? That the level of threat that a monster brings to the table doesn't hold up as you get to higher levels in 5th edition. So when I look at a book like this, I'm hoping for it to solve some of that. And they do. They for the most part, they do. I could quip that I think the monster damage is probably still too low, but I know that Paul knows what he was doing when he balanced monsters out. And they certainly have a lot of effects that are stronger for the challenge rating at higher levels. But then you look at a book that's meant to be an entire replacement for the monster manual and say, that's great, but what about low monsters? Do I care? And the argument is like, probably not. Right? There's lots of interesting stuff in here. Animated objects being a good example, right? You have animated armor. Did I need a replacement for animated armor? Not really, right? They changed it. Like there's little things from the ones that I looked at. The flying sword, challenge rating 1/4, right? It goes up and it hits +3 to hit, does 5 damage, right? They changed some stuff a little bit, but I didn't really need a new animated sword, right? I'm fine with my animated swords in 5th edition with the vanilla monster manual. So then it's like, well, it's 535 pages. How many of those pages are things that actually really help me? And how much of those pages are like, kind of don't matter? And that's a good question to ask. You still get all of the other things, though. You still get all the variants. You still get all of the behavior, the object, the legends and lore, lots of different things you could use. And that's why I say, like, I'll tell you this. I don't think that the low CR monsters in this are worse than what's in the monster manual, which gets to my question of, is this a better monster manual? Maybe. Right? And the reason why it might be maybe is because I bet you it's not any worse, right, than the monster manual is for lower monsters, and for higher challenge monsters, like having the elite traits, like having these other factors in there, like, there's lots of things in here that I think make it better. So I think it could be, right? Which is interesting. Am I going to use it instead of the monster manual? Probably not, right? I don't know. I hang on to my I don't know. I should, right? Maybe I should. Maybe next time I'll run more of this stuff and see what it's like. Really cool stuff. The Ankh eggs, all the different ways. And that, like, again, they know what they were doing. You have one designer who's kind of looking at this whole thing. Slyfish, are you happy with the Lich? Let's look at the Lich. Let's find the Lich here. It's a big book. Let's look at a dragon first, right? So I like the dragons, and the dragon stat blocks, they're big, right? Like, here's an ancient black dragon, 367 hit points. I don't know how this compares. I'm not gonna do like a side-by-side look, right? 367 hit points. How's the breath weapon? Acid breath, 22 acid. Let's see. Acid spit. I like that. They have these like spit attacks, like ranged attacks that aren't the breath weapon. 85 acid damage on an acid breath. That's great. But then check this out. Now they've got the black great worms, right? And the Black Great Worm is an elite monster, equivalent of 2 CR, 735 hit points. Concentrated acid, when first bloodied, immediately recharges his breath weapon. For the next minute, the dragon's acid becomes immensely more corrosive, including ignoring acid resistance and treating acid immunity as resistance. I love that, right? Now we've got a green dragon that can breathe and really hurt people. Elite recovery, we talked about that before. It makes gaze attacks, saving throw against roar, even if it's already succeeded. Caustic surge, dragon recharges breath weapon. Consecrated decay, dragon spits a highly concentrated blast of acid. One creature can see within 90 feet. That creature is affected as though caught in a breath weapon, right? Really, really cool. And then you have the spellcaster dragons, right? Black spellcasters, what kind of stuff they have. You're kind of getting, so first of all, the Ancient Black Dragon Great Worm. The Black Great Worm in this, way more powerful than the Great Worms that are in, I think that's right, probably, that are in Fizzbands. So you're getting a lot of Fizzband level dragon stuff in a book that's also your full replacement for the monster manual. Really cool, right? So I love that kind of stuff. These feel right. The damage feels right. Here's the Ancient Blue, right? Arc Lightning, 94 damage lightning breath, right? That's a lot of damage. So that works. But yeah, let's get to my Lich, and then I want to look at vampires, and then we'll call it well reviewed. If you haven't gotten my thing, I think it's definitely worth it. $20 for the PDF, easy. I don't know how to get the physical version. I might pick up a physical version, especially if I feel like I'm gonna run this myself. Is there a table of contents? Yeah. Oh, look at me. I'm learning things. A lot of stuff to look at here. Here we go. The Lich. I found my Lich. So I really wish, and I'm surprised that the Lich doesn't have an elite version, right? Because of all of the monsters who really could use an elite version, the Lich would be it. But the Lich's section is already pages long, right? 1 page, 2 pages, 3 pages, 4 pages. 4 pages for the Lich already. So adding an elite would make it like 5, 6. Is it worth 6 pages just for this one monster? I don't know. This is the example of like, oh my God, so much stuff, right? It's a CR21 and it's got 2 pages of stuff going on, right? That's a lot of stuff. And the reason why is they wanted to put a lot of its spells directly in the stat block. Arc Lightning. Lich targets 3 creatures within 60 feet. Each target takes DC 18. Dex saving throw failure takes 28 lightning damage. What I like about this one is it doesn't require line of effect. It doesn't require having like a line like a lightning bolt does. It's just 3 creatures within 60 feet. It works really well for Theater of the Mind. And I actually talked to Morris at N-World about that. And he said, yeah, that was intentional. We wanted to make some of the abilities work easier in Theater of the Mind than they do normally. So like you could say Arc Lightning could have been a lightning bolt, right? But it's not. So, Firebolt, Thunderwave, they basically took the spell blocks. What's interesting about this is it mirrors. So Wizards of the Coast for about 6 months thought we're going to put spell descriptions in our stat blocks to help counter the argument that it's hard to run a spellcaster. So they did that for a few books and no monster books. They did that for a couple of adventures. Mostly, I remember Descent into Avernus had this. And I wonder if like third-party designers looked at that and said, oh, okay, that's the new style, and started going that way. And now Wizards is like, no, now we're going to create new effects like Arc Lightning. And then third-party publishers are like, yeah, but I'm still describing spells in here. Right. So now we have this sort of mismatch in what the design is like. But I think it works either way. And so the idea that Fireball, 3rd level spell, is described right in the stat block to make it easy so you don't have to go look up what Fireball does. Or Confusion. Confusion's a better one because like Fireball, if you've run a bunch of them, you kind of know what Fireball does. Confusion, you don't. Disintegrate, right? So all of the big ones, Power Word Stun, Finger of Death, Disintegrate, Confusion. I'm surprised that Circle of Death isn't in here, but I guess Circle of Death isn't on the spell list anyway. So neat stuff. 170 hit points, so more hit points than a normal Lich has. Probably not as much as it could have for a CR21. But I suppose with like the rejuvenation and with other, probably if it's got some other abilities in here. Does it have lair actions? Lair features, yeah. So Lich, they have lair features. I don't know that they have lair actions, which is kind of interesting. I just noticed that. So do I like the new Lich? I do. Would I run it direct? I don't know. I think I end up customizing every Lich that I ever run anyway. And I'm sad that there isn't an elite Lich. I would love to see an elite Lich. But let's look at the vampire. So there's actually a bunch of different vampire things. Look at the pages on vampires, right? So same thing. You got your legends and lore so you can learn about your vampires. And I like how table usable that thing is, right? You can do a check and you're done. Vampire encounters, what those would look like. CR31, Elder Vampire with 2 or 3 regular vampires, right? Interesting. And so lots of different things, lair behavior, all this sort of like group behavior, what they kind of do. And then you have a straightforward vampire who is also legendary. Again, this is like, oh, it's not the way I'd have done it, right? Of course, like, well, where's your monster book, Mike? So I won't complain too much, but I will say, like, it would have been, I think, if I were doing vampires from scratch, and I have Sly Flourish's Vampires. So if you want a book about vampires, I have a PDF that you can get for free. Go to Sly Flourish, check out Sly Flourish's Vampires. Built in conjunction with Chris Sims, 5e developer. He and I worked together on that. And I would like vampires that aren't legendary. I want something above a vampire spawn that's a regular vampire that is not legendary. And then to me, elder vampires and these big fancy ones, those are the legendary ones. Instead, Wizards of the Coast and others have made the default vampire as a legendary monster. I can get there, but the thing is, sometimes I think you might face 3 or 4 vampires. There's lots of fiction where you face multiple vampires. And you can't face multiple vampires that are legendary, right? Lots of good stuff here. I'm not a fan of the charm, right? And I think that the charm is an area where I think it could have been fixed, and it wasn't here. DC 16 Wisdom saving throw. The target has at least 1 level of strife. Strife is like stress effects, right? Makes the saving throw with disadvantage. And a failed target is charmed by the vampire for 24 hours. While charmed, it regards the vampire as a trusted friend and willing target for the vampire's bite. Target repeats the saving throw each time it takes damage. Okay, so at least now you can damage your friend and knock them out of it. So that's a big difference, and I missed that. The old one, it could only be damaged by the vampire, right? So now you can just slap your friend until they are not charmed anymore, right? With the other vampire, you couldn't. With the vampire in the monster manual, only the vampire can break the charm, which is a real bad way to like pull a character out of the game, and then the player's like, well, what do I do, right? So lots of different things here. But again, another, really big stat block. And this is one where like you have all these stats like in this little corner up here, and then all the other stats on the other page, a little hard to deal with. Then you have, and now in a physical book spread though, this will at least be across the spread of the page. So it's not quite so bad. And then you have Elder Vampires, which are really cool, right? It's multiple equivalent to 2 CR11 monsters, 285 hit points, big, nasty vampires here, right? And I like those. And then you have vampire assassins and vampire mages. Again, they kind of said here are the big spells that a vampire mage is going to have: Fireball, Blight, and Shield. Vampire warriors, and then you have vampire spawns. So a lot of good stuff about vampires. Are these as good as I would want? They're pretty great. Let's look at the damage output. Bite, 1 target that is grappled, incapacitated, restrained, or willing target, 10 piercing damage plus 21 necrotic. That's a lot of necrotic damage. That's really good. A CR11, that's really good. It's interesting, this vampire is less. It looks like, and then reaction, right? It takes radiant damage, can move without provoking, warding, charm. When a creature the vampire can see attacks with a melee attack, but before the attack is made, the vampire uses charm on it, right? So it can charm somebody and then bite them. It doesn't have a slam attack, so it looks like all of its damage is in that bite. Oh no, I'm sorry. What am I looking at? Grab. 14 bludgeoning damage plus 4 necrotic. Okay, 18 damage on a grab attack. Again, only does 1, but then it can do a bite as a bonus action. You see, one of the things you'll see with the design of the level up 5e monsters is a lot more emphasis on bonus actions and on reactions. The other thing I noticed is that the legendary actions are almost always unique, right? It's rare to see, I guess in this one they have like charm and the grab attack. So it uses grab a lot, right? Good stuff. All right. I have talked this book to death. I highly recommend it. It's really cool. I think for some people, it definitely could be a just straight up replacement to the monster manual and could probably work fine. In fact, might work better. I might pick up the physical version and try that out because I'm really curious about it. I know they went through a fair bit of playtesting on it. I haven't seen anything that I read and go, oh my God, that's way off. And which is not what I could say for other people. Mike Shea's being passive aggressive. So pick it up. It's really cool. All right. That was a big spotlight. Let's do some Q&A, right? We only got 10 minutes left. Let's do some Patreon. Let's talk some questions. So I mentioned earlier in the show that on this Tuesday night, and if you are watching this on YouTube, there will be another video where it is all patron questions. I'm going to cover all of the remainder of the patron questions I have left, which is a lot of questions that I've got left over. So I'm going to do one big video where we hit all of the patron questions for January and get those and call those done. Cloaker asks, if you were to look at the core rule mechanics of 5e and how they are implemented in your current 5e games at the table, what would you rank as the 3 biggest time sinks, either for your players or yourself, that you'd like to see streamlined or even eliminated from the game, either by revision of rule set or collaborative consensus with your players? To offer some examples, 5e encumbrance rules, going to slot-based system, tedious and incremental wealth tracking, stuff like that, exhaustion rules. Interested to hear what you would cut. So a big one so I thought about this, and I think a big one that I would cut are the summon spells. The original summon spells inside the monster manual, where it's like suddenly one player now has 9 turns that they take on their turn, right? Like, I summoned 8 wolves. So it's me and my 8 wolf friends, and wolf 1 is going to go here and do this, and wolf 2 is going to go, oh my God, like whoever thought that was a good idea, right? And it's just bogs us down. We call it wolf ball because I was like, why don't we just replace it with a fireball, right? Only it's wolves, right? And we call it wolf ball. I was like, what a hassle, right? Who wants to manage that stuff? And like, I've heard all kinds of people with all kinds of house rules on how they manage that. But if you think about like, as written in it, it's a tremendous time sink. So Tasha's fixed a lot of this by basically saying you can summon monsters, but you basically summon one, and it has a stat block that can grow and get bigger. So I like that better, right? And that's something where I would certainly want to talk to my players and say, hey guys, I know you dig those summon spells. I'm going to let you finish while you talk about your summon spells, but I want to let you know that the Tasha spells are definitely superior, right? And I would switch the summon spells over to the Tasha's version. It's interesting because it's one of the things where I think Tasha's is really strong, is that some of their replacement spells are definitely better than the spells that were in the main book. So, but yeah, talk about a time sink. Anytime a player has more turns than their own, that's a time sink. And even having one is bad, like with familiars, but generally those go pretty quickly. But when you summon like 8 sprites, oh my God, right? No. Companion characters in general, I think, are a big time sink. Anytime you have more characters than players, that can be a hassle. And so I try not to have NPCs that travel with the characters. I think it's a big, unless they're like invisible and off screen. I'll tell you the kind of NPC I love to have travel with characters. Intelligent weapons are great, right? They are great ways to communicate and role play with the characters without having any actions or taking up screen real estate during your games itself. Controllery AoE spells like undead and hypnotic, like a turn undead and hypnotic pattern. I just kind of house rule a lot of times that if you hit them with that and they fail, a lot of times I just remove them from play. Though if you like walk through the whole process of like keeping them there and then do they break out and stuff like that. Like sometimes it works out if somebody goes and slaps somebody to get them out of hypnotic pattern. You know, that can kind of work. But a lot of times it's just best to remove them from play. But those things are kind of a big time. That's sort of controlling lots of monsters. It can be kind of a drag on the game. And B, they can take a lot of time. The other one, which I had read, some designers of 5e talked about this. That boy, it'd be nice if there weren't bonus actions. I don't like bonus actions. I would, and this is like almost a completely irrelevant conversation anyway, because it's not like they're going anywhere. And I don't even think in 5.5, whatever we're calling the 2024 version of D&D, I bet you they're still there. And I get why they're there. The problem is that I've seen players where you do it like after they do an action, after they move, you're like, but do you want to do a bonus action too? It's this whole other thing. And it would have been cooler if they could sort of take all of the stuff that you normally did in bonus actions and sort of pack it into actions. So a typical bonus action of like Healing Word. Imagine if Healing Word also let you cast a cantrip, right, on top of it. Or that basically like bonus actions, instead of having a bonus action, your actions have the bonus action thing tied into it, right? However, I get that things like offhand attacks, it's really convenient to basically say there are certain things that are bonus actions for everybody. I get it, right? But bonus actions would be something I get rid of only because that way you have a move and an action on your turn and it's really easy. And then once they've committed that action, they're done, right? You don't have to say anything else because there's like this whole, I do this thing. Great. Do you have anything else? No. And a lot of times, and I have a character that I play in my friend's game, and I have like 9 bonus actions. And I always have to list to be like, which one of my, for me, the bonus actions are, because I'm always going to attack. I'm a fighter, right? I'm a Rune Knight fighter. I'm always going to make a melee attack as my main action. But then I've got like 38 bonus actions to choose from. And so my turn on my decision making is which bonus action I'm going to do. And Pathfinder 2 has the 3 action system. I don't like that either. I like what Numenera does. And we're going to talk about that. Numenera, you do a thing. Right? You do one thing and that's it. All right. Keep it simple. We all have different things. Some people really like the tactically choosing of the different things. I just want like do a thing, do a cool thing and then move on. Right. Paul M. What techniques like failing forward and turning the dials of monster difficulty with techniques like failing forward and turning the dials of monster difficulty, it's possible to virtually assure PCs never die. Under what circumstances have PCs died in your game and how often has character death happened? Character death happens 2 or 3 times a campaign on the roughly, right? And bad things can still happen. Turning the dials doesn't mean saying, I'm going to turn back the damage because I don't want a character to die. Characters still die, right? The circumstance is still the circumstance. We turn the dials in order to make sure that the level and the energy of what we wanted to have happen happens. The particular dial that would stop a character from dying are usually the damage that a monster does. And I'm almost always turning that dial up, not down, right? And usually I need that dial because monsters aren't doing enough damage, right? Hit points, I will lower hit points because they've already reached a point where the characters are going to win, and we don't want to spend a lot of time. I do that instead of what I consider to be a cardinal sin, which is let's just call the battle right here. That drives me bananas as a player, right? So what I do is I turn the hit points down so that you drop faster. But I don't think I've ever done any. I'm sure that's not true. I'm sure that I've tweaked things to prevent character deaths. But I've had a lot of characters die. Not a lot, but it happens. I'm not like the brutal DM who kills characters all the time, right? I like characters live. I like characters that have a lot of background story and generally don't want to kill them a lot. But I've certainly not, I don't feel like I've ever pulled punches by using the dials to pull the punch on like preventing a character death. That's not what the dials are for, right? The dials are there to make sure that the pacing and the energy of the game are where you want it to be and where it feels right. They're not there for you to steer the story. And maybe the differences between those things are hard to figure out. And that's some advanced D&D work right there, right? Is understanding that. But yeah. David P. says, do you have a sense of why third-party content creators don't release their content digitally along the lines of D&D Beyond? Is it the lack of a good platform like D&D Beyond that's open to them? I'm assuming D&D Beyond must not be open to third party. You are correct. And PDFs aren't the same experience. Yeah, you're right. They do, right? Third party content creators release their content digitally along the lines of D&D Beyond in places like Fantasy Grounds and in Roll20. So two of the most popular virtual tabletop platforms do have lots of third party content in it, and lots of people release their stuff in those tools. They can't do it in D&D Beyond because D&D Beyond is exclusive to D&D. So I think only they have like one or two tiny little things, mostly Critical Role stuff that they include in D&D Beyond, but they can't include Kobold Press stuff, for example, right? That has to do with the licensing for D&D Beyond. And it gets to me to be a problem of D&D Beyond that it can't have that third party stuff. Why aren't they making their own? Why doesn't Kobold Press have it? Because building a portal like that, now you got to maintain a big website, and that's a hassle, right? So building I'm of the belief, and I think my friend Evil John here will disagree with me. I'm of the belief that building something like D&D Beyond is a pretty extensive experience. That's a lot of work, right? With real developers and like a full-time staff that's going to manage troubleshooting and stuff like that. It's hard to host something like that. Could you put your monsters up online? Probably, right? And, I think like some do, right? I think Kobold Press has an SRD or their own OGL and puts them up that way. But it's hard to do. So that means you need another existing platform. And the only ones that really are ubiquitous are like Roll20, Fantasy Grounds, and D&D Beyond. So yeah. Nicole Vanderhoven says, hey, why not just give us the markdown files? Because you and I would be real happy with that, right? But I'm guessing most people don't want markdown files. I do. One thing I do is like I release all my stuff, not everything, but many of my books in EPUB because I want them to be flexible for different platforms. That's a little better, right? Like at least I'm handing you all the digital versions so that you can view that on your phone easily and stuff like that. I can't do it for everything, right? And it's hard to do with stuff like stat blocks. So I think the real reason why is because like hosting your own thing is really hard work. And also part of it is the industry has cemented itself around PDFs. And frankly, it's good enough. My opinion is it's good enough. I don't complain about getting PDFs. So yeah, right. And DM Chromie brings up the whole thing about Runic Games had a League of Legends thing that was up on D&D Beyond for like 30 seconds. And they got taken down, apparently smacked down by Wizards of the Coast. The relationship between D&D Beyond and Wizards of the Coast, I don't know that we know a lot about it, but it certainly is preventing third-party stuff. Logic error. When I DM, I think a lot about how NPCs and monsters approach a fight, and one of the things I have a hard time with is morale. The DMG rules don't really make sense to me, and I haven't yet hit upon a good solution of my own mechanically, so I usually wing it. I'm wondering if you have any tips. I'm fine with what the DMG provides. The DMG, let's take a look. Speaking of D&D Beyond, I'll go to D&D Beyond, look up morale. So the DMG has a system for morale, which is very straightforward, which is under certain circumstances, creatures might flee. And if you want to determine if they're going to flee, make them make DC 10 wisdom saving throws for the creature or the creature's leader. If they fail to save, that means they run away. I am good with mechanically light systems. I don't need a mechanically heavy system, right? I'm good with like, give me the minimum I need. This is fine. The other thing is I would say before I do any of this, I would just get my head in the creature and say it doesn't make sense for them to flee, right? And that's the easiest way is, given the intelligence of the creature and what's going on with them, and maybe you look at the stats like Keith Alman recommends, you look at the stats and say, is a creature smart enough to recognize like this is a losing fight, right? But if you want to roll like if they're panicked, like will they take an opportunity attack to flee? The DC 10 Wisdom save I think is a good way to go, right? So I would start with what makes sense for this is like the Sly Flourish Mike Shea default view. What makes sense for the story, right? Is like the easiest part of this. What makes sense for the story first, right? Think about the story. Think about what makes sense. Look into this creature. Look into the circumstance. Getting in the head of the creature doesn't make sense that they'd run away. Yeah, then they run away. But are they surrounded by 3 fighters and a paladin? Right? You know, Kobold is surrounded by 3 fighters and a paladin. Is the Kobold going to run away? Maybe it makes a wisdom saving throw. On a fail, it runs and takes a smite and 3 attacks. On the other hand, maybe it says I surrender, right? So I think start with what makes sense for the story, and then I think I'm fine with the DMG rules. And I'm sure there's other people that have other rule sets out there for how to handle morale, but I'm really happy with it. Ken B, do you have any recommendations for good 4th edition adventures to run in the Nentir Vale setting using 5e rules? I'm doing Harkenwald for a group, and I would like some other ideas to continue the game after that. I recommend taking a look at Madness at Gardmore Abbey. Is it on the DM's Guild? I should have checked before It is. So Madness at Gardmore Abbey, and who wrote that? Greg Billsland. Oh, Crichton. I didn't know really. Crichton Broadthurst wrote that. Mike Marles and Chris Perkins wrote it. Interesting. So Crichton, who does Raging Swan, right? I think, isn't Crichton Broadhurst the guy who does Raging Swan? Or is that a different Crichton? That might be a different Crichton. Might be a different one. But Madness at Gardmore Abbey, you can pick it up for 12 books. This was a box set that came out for 4th edition of D&D later on in 4th edition style. And it was they were doing lots of experimenting with different kinds of things. It is a very good adventure, a fun adventure where you have lots of multiple dungeons that are separated by these physical areas. It manages to capture a lot of like the classic Greyhawk style dungeon delving, but also has fun stuff and includes the deck of many things. And in the physical, I actually have a physical copy of it on my shelf over there. And the physical version came with a copy of the deck of many things. So it is a really cool adventure. I think you'll get a lot out of it. I haven't looked at it in a long time, but I remember liking it a lot. And I ran it. Right? I ran it for my group, and my group ran it a lot. So I definitely, that you ask for a recommendation, I would definitely recommend checking out Madness at Gardmore Abbey. We have, there's a Numenera. Let's do the Numenera question, because we're going right into Numenera. This will be going. The Numenera setting and the Cipher system as a whole make a part of the experience points awarded to the players dependent on them making discoveries about the world. When they discover something that is useful to them, which is important, then they get 1 to 4 XP depending on the size of the discovery and usefulness. I have therefore replaced the Secrets and Clues step with a Discoveries and Clues step in my prep for Cipher. This is handy because I'm about to do that right after this. The differences are that 1, I do not just create 10 secrets which the players might not care about, because I have come up with at least 1 important use for the discovery. 2, I have an actual reason to come up with at least some clues, as in the name of the steps, which you intentionally do not do because clues should be improvised. I ask myself, how do I expect the players to at least learn where there is something to discover so that they can do the rest? Do you have any thoughts on this in the discovery theme of Numenera, given that you said you'd be playing the system in this soon? Soon is going to be in 5 minutes. So I think there's one thing you said which makes me raise an eyebrow, right? And that is when you say, I do not create 10 secrets which the players might not care about. The definition by my writing in Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master is these are things the players would care about. This is information the players would care about, which means the characters would probably care about it too, right? So secrets and clues when you're coming up with the 10 should be things that are relevant to the characters, right? They should always be relevant to the characters. I think what you're asking, and calling them discoveries and clues, I think is fine. Like secrets and clues, it's just a term, right? It doesn't matter. So calling them discoveries is perfectly fine, right? That's a perfect way to go. And I think that fits the idea of Numenera discovery, right? So I think that that's a fine way to go. Oh, Rang of Arg says that Crichton is the guy from Raging Swan. That is really cool. So the dude from Raging Swan, whose products I adore, was one of the writers for Gardmore Abbey. I did not realize that. That is really cool. So yeah, I think your approach is fine, right? And I think if you want to look at an important clue and say, how can they discover that? And are there multiple, I would say, are there multiple ways that they get discovered? I think that's a fine way to go. But I think secrets and clues, because a lot of that came from ideas from like Numenera, right? A lot of the stuff that I do regularly in my D&D games came from my use of Numenera, because I love Numenera so much. So yeah, I think that's a fine way to go. And we'll experiment with it right now. Thank you for that question, Ingo L. My friends, I want to thank you very much for hanging out with me today to talk about all things D&D. Again, remember, D&D is important. Getting together with your friends to play games is important. And I love doing it. And I also love hanging out with you to talk about it every week. So thank you all very much for coming. If you enjoyed this video, you can help me out by subscribing to the Sly Flourish newsletter, supporting me directly on Patreon, subscribing to my videos on YouTube, or picking up any of my books. Thank you all very much. Have a great day. Get out there and play some D&D.